Hello, and welcome to another operation guide in Star Wars The Old Republic. My name is Marlin, and today we'll be talking about the Terror from Beyond operation. Terror from Beyond is the fourth operation in the game's history and is set on the planet Asation. You can reach the entry point to the operation on the Republic or Imperial fleet. Terror from Beyond has 5 boss encounters, and we'll be going through each of these relatively quickly to tell you all the key things you need to know to defeat this operation in story mode. First boss encounter is the Writhing Horror, which is a very straightforward boss. The main things to know is the main tank for this fight should grab the Writhing Horror and always face it away from the group during the entire encounter, as it does have a cleave attack that you don't want to hit the rest of the group. It's also important to try to make sure that the tank keeps aggro on the boss the entire time, because they are building up stacks of a debuff that affect when the group will get adds during the fight. You'll see that the boss does periodically tunnel and relocate. In story mode, this is a fixed rotation, so it always goes in the same order as you see it move throughout the fight. Anytime that happens, the tank should just pick the boss up, face it away from the group at all times, while the group continues to attack the boss. Now you'll notice there are some flowers around the room. Those are going to become important momentarily. And so here we note that a jealous male arrives to defend his mate. Shortly after that, some little adds are going to spawn. So what you want to have happen is you want one player, a ranged DPS or healer, to go stand in the puddle. That attracts the foul offspring, but puts a debuff on them where they do very little damage, and it makes it very easy to AoE them down. As you can see, we've already killed them. So anytime there's a puddle, you want one player to stand in it. Doesn't matter who in story mode. After that, you want your group to kill the jealous male. It deals decent damage. Preferably want your second tank or just a DPS to pick it up and face it away from the group. And after you kill the little adds, you kill the jealous male, and then back on the Writhing Horror. And you notice the boss has tunneled again to its third location, which is normal. The only other thing that you really need to know for this fight is that periodically there will be a dot that goes out to a random player, and you should just cleanse the damage over time effect immediately, and then continue with the mechanics. So there's the dot is applied to one of the healers, that kind of reddish-orange one. You just cleanse it immediately. Now you'll notice the tank is getting stacks. The number of stacks that are present on the tank when the jealous male comes out is going to determine how many adds you get. So right now they're at 6. So they'll probably get 6, or maybe they'll get another stack and get 7, and we'll end up with that number of adds whenever the next jealous male spawns. So now the boss is tunneled to its 4th location, to the right of that grate. Its 5th location is just to the left. So now we've got the jealous male. So now we need to go to the flower. So as a ranged DPS in this fight, I'm moving back to the flower, and notice how the adds all come to me, and they also are debuffed. So they do like 5 or 10% of their normal damage. So even as a DPS, you can see I'm taking very, very little damage, and it's easy to AoE them down. And then we kill the jealous male again, and then back on the boss, and that's pretty much it. This is a very straightforward fight as long as you keep the boss faced away from the group, and as long as someone's stepping into the flower to control those adds. This is a very straightforward fight and should be very easy, even for relatively new groups. The next boss encounter is the Dread Guards encounter. Dread Guards is a 3-boss fight where the group has to defeat one boss at a time. The kill order is always the same, which is Herod, then Kephess, then Kelsara, or as they're marked here, Lightning, and then Flame, and then Gun. Your tanks are going to want to hold aggro on Kephess and Kelsara during the fight. There is a tank swap, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The group will always begin on Herod. Herod has no aggro table, and so we'll just randomly shoot people with Force Lightning throughout the entirety of Phase 1 in story mode. Otherwise, there's only one mechanic for this fight in this phase you need to worry about, and pretty much there's more or less one mechanic that's unique to each phase. This mechanic in Phase 1 is Surging Chains. So what's happening here is that Kephess leaps to near Herod and puts a shield on him. You can see here, if you're watching carefully, we interrupted Kephess. You have to deal sufficient damage to him to enable the ability to interrupt him. And so you basically, all the DPS swap Kephess and damage him until the interrupt becomes available. Then you interrupt that channeled ability, which breaks the shield around Herod. And then the DPS swap back to Herod and resume damaging him. You don't want to continue damaging Herod because the shield around him will reflect damage. So you want all the DPS to swap. until you can interrupt and then go back to Herod. During this time, the tanks should be holding Kephess and Kelsara. In story mode, Kelsara places a stacking debuff on her target, and so you will usually want to do a tank swap. Around 10 or so stacks is a pretty good target, although depending on your healers, you can go quite a bit higher without too much difficulty. And in fact, it is possible to solo tank this fight, or it's not too terribly difficult to solo tank it if you have a DPS player that has a taunt who can taunt Kelsara and hold her for a brief time to let your stacks drop off and reset is also a viable option. Otherwise, the group will continue DPSing Herod, and you'll continue through however many of these sets of surging chains that you need to in order to get past him. And then you'll move on to the second phase, which will be DPSing Kephess. Now, the Kephess encounter is probably the most difficult in story mode because it has an insta-kill mechanic called Doom, which we'll begin to see. The main thing to note when you move to this phase is that people will begin dropping green puddles. So there you see the first one. There are a couple ways to identify this. One is that if you watch your player's character bar carefully, you'll see little green motes underneath their feet as an indicator that it's about to happen. If you watch your raid frame very carefully during this phase, you'll note that there's a green debuff that appears on a character's bar for a couple of seconds, and then it disappears, and as soon as it disappears, they drop a green puddle. And so that's your cue. So there you see I'm dropping one. The idea is to move out of these so that you don't use them. Once a player gets doomed, as you can see here, they get 2 stacks in story mode of the Doom debuff. The debuff lasts 30 seconds, and if you don't cleanse it successfully in that time, when it expires, it will one-shot you. The way that you cleanse Doom is by running through these green puddles. So you want to leave them available for your team members to use to avoid dying to Doom. It is possible to use a few of them by accident and still have plenty. As you can see here, they come out very, very frequently. If you do step into a green puddle by accident, you'll get a green dot. So here you can see I got Doom, used 2 green puddles, and now I'm good to go. Like I said, if anyone else steps into one by accident, they'll get a little green orb-looking debuff on their bar that will deal a little bit of periodic damage, but overall is not too dangerous. The only other thing to note is that Kephess will occasionally choke someone, in which case just interrupt it. And otherwise, the group should just continue damaging. Your tanks may need one swap during this phase, if need be. That's fine. And that's it for this phase. It is possible for some classes to cheese the Doom mechanic and avoid using puddles. So for example, a gunslinger, if you time your hightail it roll just right, you can mitigate the damage from Doom that would otherwise kill you. Sage sorcerers can use Force Barrier. Some classes can use Reflect abilities, and so on. I don't really recommend that in story mode because you get so many puddles, as you can see here, that it's not typically going to be an issue at all. It is worth noting, though, that once you get a certain number of puddles, they actually will stop spawning. But otherwise, the group just continues to DPS Kephess until he's gone, and then you move on to Kelsara. Kelsara is very straightforward in story mode. She only has really one extra mechanic. That mechanic is she will periodically mark a player for death, and when that happens, she'll connect an energy beam to that player, and she'll swap aggro to them and will try to move to them. She'll walk towards them steadily, and if she gets to you, she'll deal quite a bit of damage. So if you get marked for death, you should just run away. Save a movement ability of force speed or roll or what have you for that phase can help. If you're a player like a sage or sorcerer that has a friendly pull, that can be helpful, although avoiding her is usually not too difficult in story mode. The only other thing to note is there's a dot that she puts out called Writhing Horror. It is an AoE based dot, so whenever she applies it, any player that's near the player she targets will get it as well. So you could see we had 2 players get it in this instance. The dot doesn't tick particularly hard in story mode, so it's not a big deal to heal through. But ideally, you'd want the group to be a little bit spaced out until the dot goes out, and then you can stack pretty efficiently and not be too worried about it. And that's pretty much the fight. If you need to do a swap during this phase for Kelsara, it's fine. Although, as you note, because of the length of that marked for death mechanic, if the tank runs away from Kelsara a little bit during that phase, they can buy themselves typically just enough time for the debuff to reset. And then that's it. Okay, the next boss encounter is the Operator 9 fight. This one can be a little bit confusing, but is relatively straightforward with just a little bit of planning. So the first thing to note is that you will want your group to be evenly divided amongst each color phase. So in 8-man, that means 2 people per color phase. In 16-man, it's 4 per color phase. This fight, the first phase goes through these 4 colors in sequence: blue, and then orange, and then purple, and then yellow. And so what happens is, for each color phase, you're going to want one person who's going to be in the middle. So that's going to be standing near the master control in that blue circle and during the first phase. And it'll change colors as you go through each phase. Whenever that happens, that's going to empower a panel around the room that when another player, who will be the channeler, clicks on it, will bring down the shield on these cores that we're going around the room damaging. Anytime the shields are not down, you want to kill the adds. If it's your color phase, so this, I'm orange, so notice someone's in the middle. That powers up this core, this panel here that I go and then click on. Now, if I get damaged, as just happened now, that breaks the channel and I need to click the panel again. Or if I move by accident, that will break the channel and I need to click again to keep the shields down on the 2 data cores. The data cores rotate around the room. They're always going to be 180 degrees opposite each other. So you can see here, there's one on the opposite side. They killed the second one and we move on to purple. Same thing is going to repeat. You're always going to want one player in the middle and then one player that will go and channel on their core. And typically you would want tanks and healers to be in the middle, is typically the most efficient, and then you have a DPS player channel. That way every phase you have most of your DPS available, and you always have your tanks and healers pretty much free to deal with adds. And so you can see here we brought the shields down on the purple cores, and now we damage this one, and then the one directly across the room will be the second one. If you do fail a color phase in story mode, it's not a big deal. If that happens, you'll actually want to stop DPSing the cores and go deal with the adds that spawn first. Although the DPS check is relatively easy, as you can see, you have 70 seconds per color phase. I do highly suggest, if you have focus target and the focus target cast bar feature enabled, to focus target the master control. That's the hologram in the middle, which will let you see them and let you see the timer, as you can see here in the center of my screen, that shows you how much time you have for each phase, which is pretty generous in story mode. And now we're on yellow, which is the 4th color phase. So we brought down the shields. Now we're going to destroy the data cores. And then we'll move on to phase 2, where we'll actually get to fight the Terror from Beyond and the actual boss fight. Once you get to phase 2 in story mode, you've kind of passed the worst of it. So we're going to clean up the bigger adds, the regulators here. Then we're just going to get on the boss. This guy is very straightforward. He'll alternate between being attacked and then shielding. So when he shields and you do a mechanic called Black Obtuse, everybody needs to move around the room and stand inside the color circles that correspond to your color. So in this example, I'm orange, so I'm running to the orange circles and I stand in them until they deactivate, and then I go run to another one. It is random how many colors you get of each color. You could get 2 or you could get 4. So some people may need to run around more than others, but you want to keep moving until you deactivate all of them. If you fail to deactivate all of them, then the boss will hit everyone for some AoE damage. It typically will not one-shot the group in story mode, but still something to be avoided. When he is shielded, he does not take any damage, but you can pre-apply dots and use abilities to proc certain passive effects to allow you to have some big burst as soon as the shield goes down. And that's pretty much the fight. You alternate between attacking him and doing the Black Obtuse color circle mechanics, and then you're good to go. The 4th boss fight in Terror from Beyond is Kephess the Undying, who makes a return after being the last boss in Explosive Conflict. This fight has 3 phases, although the first phase used to have noteworthy mechanics and does in both Veteran and Master mode. A while back, this fight, amongst others, was changed, and so now the first phase is literally a dummy parse. And so there's really nothing to say other than just enjoy the parse and be careful not to pick up the boredom debuff that could cause you to fall asleep at the keyboard. Otherwise, we'll pick this back up once we get the boss to 50%. Okay, so here we are about to get the boss to 50%. While it's fine to use your big offensive cooldowns in the opener, I do actually suggest, as they come back off cooldown, saving them so that you have them available for the first tower phase that we'll see here momentarily. But at 50% he'll jump. You'll want to get out of the middle to avoid being punted. You'll see these pillars that pop up from the ground. You want to avoid those, or you'll be punted and take a little bit of damage and lose some uptime. Now what you'll see during this phase is towers will spawn around the room. You'll also see Kephess periodically leap. When he does that, he'll come down in the red circles. Whoever gets that red circle should move out of the group. Otherwise, you want to pull Kephess to one of the towers. Now, you'll notice players are getting nanites. That's the green debuff that they get. In story mode, it does fall off naturally after time, or you can click on the tower and channel to cleanse it. Whenever you break the channel, it falls, and if it hits the boss, as it did here, he will be temporarily stunned and will take very, very significantly more damage. And so it's a good time to use your offensive cooldowns. In story mode, because the dot of nanites naturally falls off and doesn't tick that hard, I usually suggest pulling the boss from tower to tower to tower and then trying to just hit him with it. Now, you do need to be careful, because as you see here, I actually broke the channel a little too fast right as he leapt into the air, and so it did not knock him down. So if you think he's about to jump, it's sometimes good to hold off and wait. Otherwise, you want to hit him with it as soon as you can. So you see here, we start the channeling, and then as soon as he gets close, we're going to break it, and then we're going to attack him. We are burning really, really fast here. At 10%, he does a soft enrage, where he stands up and starts channeling these orange circles. So you just move around, run around, dodge the orange circles, and DPS him down, and that's the fight. The last boss of the fight is the Terror from Beyond itself. Now this fight has two very, very different phases, so let's talk about them in sequence. The first phase has the group fighting pairs of tunneling tentacles. Those are these big tentacles. Now the first thing to note as you move around the room is don't get too close to the boss. If you get too close to the Terror, you will instantly die. That's particularly important for tanks who need to stand relatively close to the boss to aim those tentacles away from the group, because as you watch, you will see they periodically slam, which is a conal you want to face away from the group. The other thing that'll happen during this phase is the boss will periodically throw spit at any players that are not within melee range of the tunneling tentacle. So typically you'll have a healer or ranged DPS stand out to kite those and just don't stand in them. You'll also see these unstable larvae that pop up from the water. There'll be one per tunneling tentacle, and they'll aggro to whichever player has the aggro of that tentacle, so typically to a tank. And what they'll do is they will not attack anyone, but they'll try to chase down that player, typically a tank, and if they get there, they'll explode and deal damage, so you'll have your DPS kill them. Now once you kill each pair of tunneling tentacles, you'll get a wave of birthed lava, sometimes called linebackers or whatever other name. You want to avoid them, you don't want to damage them. If you aggro them in any way, they will run to you and explode. But they will not one-shot you in story mode. After you do that, you'll repeat this cycle again. You get another pair of tunneling tentacles that you need to burn down, and periodically you'll get spit. Periodically you'll get unstable larvae from the water that will move to the tanks and explode, that the DPS should destroy. And then once you kill the pair of tunneling tentacles, you'll get birthed larvae again. Now it's worth noting in story mode, you do not have to burn down the tunneling tentacles evenly. So if you want to, you can put all of your DPS on one tentacle and then just put a tank or even a DWT, a DPS with taunt is fine to hold the other tentacle. And as long as the healer, as long as they have their own healer, they'll be fine. And that does shorten this phase one quite a bit. To get through it faster. The way this mechanic works is as you kill the tunneling tentacles, that is what deals damage to the boss. So you don't ever want to damage the boss directly. But otherwise, you just go through this cycle. You kill the unstable larvae so they don't explode. Or if your tank has a good defensive, they can just run into them. It's not a big deal in story mode. Just don't try doing that in higher difficulties. In story mode, you'll get 3 pairs of tunneling tentacles, so now the group is on its 3rd pair of tunneling tentacles. And again, it's just rinse and repeat the same mechanics. Burn down the tentacles, don't stand in spit, destroy the unstable larvae when they spawn from the water, and that's it. Once we finish off this 3rd pair of tunneling tentacles, there'll be a brief pause, and then we'll be teleported up into phase 2, which is up near the dimensional vortex. Okay, so at this point, after you kill the 3rd pair of tunneling tentacles, you can avoid the larva for just a brief moment, and then the entire group will be briefly immobilized and then pulled up into the hypergate vortex above the boss, and you can see those floating platforms. We're about to get a much closer look at them. Now we're in the second phase where we're dealing more directly with the terror, and you'll notice this whole area looks very, very different compared to just about any other instance of the fight. So we're going to take a look at this for a moment, and then we're going to talk about strategy. You'll notice there are all these floating platforms throughout the room. The way that you navigate between them is you see the little portals on each side. If you step into one of those, it will allow you to automatically jump to the adjacent platform, and so you can readily navigate throughout the area. The other thing you need to know is that there are no range limitations on your abilities. So as a healer, I'm standing here on one of the first platforms, and yet as long as I have a line of sight, so as long as someone doesn't stand in such a way that they're hiding behind a platform, then I can heal anyone in the entire room regardless of range. Now, there is an important exception to that, which is if you're trying to damage an enemy, you can damage the terror from anywhere in the room. But the tunneling tentacles, which are your primary opponent during this phase, can only be damaged if you're standing on the same platform as the tunneling tentacles. So DPS generally need to be standing on the platform that's the same as whatever they're attempting to damage. Healers can heal everyone from anywhere. Tanks can tank the boss from anywhere. The only other thing to note as a healer in particular is that some of your abilities that are manually placed AoE abilities, such as your AoE heal for pretty much every class and a handful of others, cannot be used anywhere. So if you want to use your manually placed AoEs, you'll have to be standing on the same platform as the person you're trying to heal. However, some of your automatically healing abilities that will heal multiple targets, such as Wandering Mend or Successive Treatment, those abilities will still work fine because they're targeted to a single player. So let's pause now for a moment and talk about the overall positioning and strategy for what we're trying. Okay, so here you can see one of the maps that illustrate this area. There are any number of other graphics floating around, and the numbering system for the platforms varies across different maps. It's not super important. The main thing is just to understand visually what's going on here. So as you can see here, this graphically illustrates most of the platforms. The home platform, platform 1 on this map, is actually not slightly visible because it's just at the just below the map where you load in. And then you can see there's an outer half ring of platforms and then an inner circular ring of platforms around the boss. A couple of things to note here are the graphical illustrations with regards to anomalies, which are not relevant in story mode. What we care about here are irregularities and tentacles. So you'll notice that platforms, in this map, platforms 10, 16, 12, and 14, where there you see an indicator for a person standing, do not have a green dot and instead have a red circle next to them. These are the 4 platforms where we'll be dealing with tunneling tentacles. In the first phase, there will be tunneling tentacles at 12 and 14, at the front lower left and the front lower right. The second wave, they'll swap to the back left and back right at 10 and 16, and then the third time they'll come back to 12 and 14 in the same position that they were in the first wave when you first load into the room. So that'll be primarily where the DPS are spending most of their time during this fight. In between the tentacle phases, you'll be dealing with irregularities. As you can see, those are marked by a green circle, and every platform other than the platforms that spawn tentacles will get an irregularity during the irregularity phase that takes place between the waves of tunneling tentacles. And during that phase, people will be running around DPSing the irregularities, as we'll see shortly. And so this map helps illustrate the positioning and movement for the DPS that'll alternate between just dealing with tentacles and dealing with the irregularities. Now let's talk about strategy by role, because it's a little tricky to see this fight from just one perspective. Okay, first let's talk about what you do as a DPS during the second phase. So as you load in, you're going to jump down and you're going to be DPSing the 2 tunneling tentacles. That's your primary job. Just like in the first phase, the way that you deal damage to the boss is by damaging these tunneling tentacles. Again, you need to be standing on the same platform as the tentacle that you are damaging. So if you're a ranged player, you have to be standing on the same platform. You cannot snipe it from another platform. It's also important to watch out for your target. Sometimes the targeting in this fight can be a little bit tricky, where you may accidentally or inadvertently, or even without doing anything, may find that your target swapped to the Terror from Beyond. It's very important that nobody is directly damaging the Terror. If you deal too much damage to the Terror, you'll actually skip to the burn phase early, which can be problematic if that happens really, really early in the fight. And you'll notice we've just about killed the first tunneling tentacle, and now we're going to swap to the second one. If you're watching the boss's health, you notice he took around 7% of his health when we killed each tentacle. Now, once you move to the second platform, it's just rinse and repeat. As far as strategy, some teams may choose to DPS the tentacles evenly, some may choose to have all DPS go one direction than the other. Doesn't really matter. You will notice that the Grasping Tentacle does have an attack where it will cast Slam, and then will slam on that platform and deal damage to any player on the platform. In story mode, you can almost always just take the damage. You don't necessarily need to dodge it. If you do so, you can jump off the platform as I just did there, although I'm actually leaving to get pre-positioned for the next phase. Just pop a defensive or something like that. Now, once both pairs of tunneling tentacles or grasping tentacles are down, you're going to get irregularities. And we saw that before on the map. Every platform that never spawns a tentacle gets one. The objective for the strategy is we have 30 seconds to kill all the irregularities. So the team needs to spread out and each person take a platform or two and kill an irregularity. It's usually a good idea to have the healers get one, have each tank try to get one, particularly the one in the very back behind the boss, and that leaves in 8-man instances DPS need to get at least 2, if not 3. In 16-man it usually means each person gets 1, which isn't too difficult. Now if you don't kill all of them, they'll start to tick for damage, as you can see here. Each one that's alive will tick for damage every few seconds. One that's left alive doesn't tick for that many points of damage. Here in this particular example, this was early in 7.0, so many of us were still working on gearing and all of those things. We were a little behind, and we had, I think, 3 or so still left alive, and so 3 or 4 of them ticking for damage is actually pretty problematic and can be very troublesome to heal through. So the goal is to spread out, kill them as quickly as possible, and then once you're done with that, once that phase ends, another wave of tentacles spawns, and then the DPS just rinses and repeats this cycle, and killing the 2 in the back, and then we'll rinse and repeat again. Okay, now let's talk about it from the healer's perspective. This is a little bit simpler. Generally, you're going to want to find a position that gives you a good line of sight on everyone. So usually standing at the home platform isn't a bad idea, or you can jump down to one of the lower platforms, or if you want to, you can kind of move around a bit, whatever is comfortable. Again, as long as you have a clear line of sight on every player, you can heal them from anywhere. Generally, from a damage perspective, most of your healing is going to be on the tanks. Then when you reach the irregularity phase, you generally are going to want to help kill at least one if you can get a second. That's going to be really helpful in 8-man. But keep in mind, players are going to be taking damage while everyone's attacking the irregularities, so you likely won't be able to damage the entire time. So usually it's kill one of them on one platform, and then go back to healing to top everyone up. Because if for some reason you don't kill all the irregularities, you want people to be relatively high on health, so there's enough cushion to take damage. As you can see here, we're taking some extra damage. Not a big deal, as long as we had everyone reasonably topped off beforehand. And then you're going to keep going through this cycle until you reach burn phase. Okay, now let's talk about it from the tank's perspective. Now, the first thing to know is that you can stand wherever you want in story mode. The only real thing you need to watch out for is try not to stand anywhere that a DPS or healer is going to want to stand. So you don't want to stand at the home platform. You don't want to stand on the same platform as the tentacle, because whenever the boss attacks you, he'll deal damage to anyone else that's on the same platform as you. So you want that to just be you. The other thing you need to know is that it's actually pretty easy to lose aggro on the Terror because of how the boss's damage resistance work. Until you get to burn phase, the boss has very, very high damage resistance, and so your ability to generate threat is limited because of the boss's damage resistance. Meanwhile, the healers, who are dealing healing to everyone in the group and generating heal aggro, are not limited by that. So surprisingly, it can be relatively easy for a healer to pull aggro, and so I highly suggest guarding your healers if you can. Now, from a positioning perspective, again, you can stand wherever you want. The usual positionings are either to stand here on these lower platforms, and you usually want to be on the opposite side of the room from the side where the DPS are dealing with tentacles. So this first wave, you're in the back. After the first wave, you'll basically swap positions with the DPS. Some players in story mode prefer standing on the outer ring of platforms. That works as well. The damage taken from the boss is not that high in story mode. Now, the other mechanics you need to watch out for are his spit and scream mechanic, which we'll talk about in a moment. In between phases, when you're dealing with hypergate irregularities, as tanks, you don't deal as much damage, so it's difficult to get more than maybe 2. It's usually a good idea for one of the tanks to get the back platform there that I just got, and then just go help out with someone else. The main thing to be aware of is know who has aggro on the boss, because that player, that tank, needs to get back into position a little earlier so that you're not standing with a bunch of people when that cycle ends and now the boss is cleaving the entire group. Okay, the other thing we need to talk about is the main mechanics for the boss, which are spit and scream for the tanks. This is actually a video from veteran mode, because I didn't actually have a good clip somehow in story mode from the tank's perspective where they're actually getting spit. So whoever has aggro is eventually going to be spit on. The boss is going to put spit on the platform you're standing on. The spit will persist for a while and will deal pretty heavy damage to anyone who stands in it. So as soon as that happens, you need to jump to an adjacent platform so you're no longer standing in spit, and then you'll get Scream. Scream is a cast ability that deals pretty high damage, even in story mode. It is a force-based attack, so it can be mitigated with defensives. You don't have to swap in story mode. You do in veteran mode. Now here in veteran mode, there's a debuff that gets applied that you then have to teleport home to cleanse. In story mode, you don't have to do that. So you can either swap if your group has a second tank. You can also run with just one tank, in which case just stand on a platform that doesn't have spit and just continue holding the boss, and the healers will heal you through it. Personally, I recommend doing a tank swap because it's good practice to be on the lookout for the mechanics so that you know how to do it in higher difficulties. Okay, so now let's put it all together and talk about burn phase. So again, you go through this cycle where you deal with 2 pairs of grasping tentacles while the tanks hold the boss. Then you kill irregularities. Then you get another wave of grasping tentacles in the back, and then a second wave of irregularities, and then you get a third wave of grasping tentacles here at the front, and then you go to burn phase. Now, burn phase is triggered either after you kill 6 grasping tentacles, so all 3 waves, which reduces the boss's health below 16%. Or if you deal too much direct damage to the boss, you can push him early, and he'll be at whatever level of health he's at. Now when you go to burn phase, you want to spread out. He enters Furious Tantrum. What's going to happen is the boss is going to begin hitting somebody for high damage and then dropping threat on that person and then moving basically down the threat table, dealing damage to players 1 hit at a time and doing fairly high damage. So during this phase, you want to spread out, have each person on their own platform. They can attack the boss from any range. Tanks should cycle through defensives and use their taunts to try to keep aggro on them as much as possible. Healers should just kind of hang on, and then you burn the boss down, and once you reach 3%, you're done. Pretty easy burn phase unless you somehow push the boss early. So again, make sure at all times you're targeting the tentacles prior to getting to burn phase. And otherwise, pretty easy peasy. Okay, thank you so much for watching this video guide. I hope it was helpful in giving you a quick rundown of all the key things you need to know to clear the Terror from Beyond operation in story mode. If you want more details on veteran mode or master mode or other operations or class guides, feel free to check out my website at www.merlinswotor.com or be on the lookout for more videos and channels here on YouTube. Thanks so much, and may the Force be with you.